So I'm going to go ahead and I'll put these overheads, for example, into should be everybody's favorite new thing, a routing folder. Okay, right, and we're going to reach route tracks new folder. Great. Okay, there we go. So in this case, I can use one compressor for the two overheads because they were a stereo configuration, right? We have this space pair. So they're kind of like one source in effect. Right? So I'll pan them so I have overhead left and overhead right. They probably don't have to be that wide. And then let's see. Oh, that's really good. Check out our kick. Right? We're getting a lot of that drum set there, right? That kick drum is there for that extra punch, that larger than life sound. So in this case, I could, for example, put a compressor on these overheads and do a similar thing, right? The overheads are going to have probably less dynamic range. We'll look at the meters and get a clue, right? Because they were further away, right? So they're not so close like the kick drum was, where the beater is going to be really loud and the resonance of the drum is going to be much softer. They're further away, and therefore they're not going to have the intensity of being so close to the impact, right? Like the snare mics will, because they're right next to the stick. This little bit of distance allows the sounds to kind of, reach a more similar energy because of that little bit of distance. It's only a couple of feet, but in sound terms, sound traveling through here, a couple of feet's a lot. So let's look at that. So it's, instead of 18 dB difference like the kick drum, it's about 12, which is not 30% less. Okay, 12 versus 18 is half. Okay, that has half the difference in dynamic range in the snare. That's what 6 decibels is. 6 decibels is double the audible volume that we hear. Okay, so much closer. Okay, in this case, 12 dB might still be a case for using a relatively high, or a little bit higher ratio, nonetheless. Okay, so I'll just arbitrarily turn it up here, and then we can start putting the threshold down. Same thing. We're trying to get the cymbals and the rest of the drum kit all confined into a little bit smaller space so that we hear it all together. I'll turn off the kick drum for now. There's like the different components of the drums, right? They really are in very different sort of dynamic spaces, okay? And we want to get that a little bit more focused. Kick, the snare, and the cymbals are in a very focused range. I went fairly aggressive here on the threshold, okay? And I'll turn it on and off like I did before, okay, so we can hear a difference. And you'll hear, yeah, before it sounds like all the pieces are sort of in their own little dynamic space, and then with the compressor, they sound like they're in a much more focused space, okay? Snare, which was kind of much louder than everything else before, is kind of getting squashed when it hits, right? We can even hear the cymbals when they're getting squashed a little bit relative to the kick as well, right? That's a pretty big change. So this one's not as nearly as subtle as the kick, okay? Right, so for the listener, it really gives me a sense of hearing that drummer really attacking all those drums with, quite a bit of energy, because I'm not hearing these three different dynamic levels, right? Whereas without the compressor, I mostly hear the snare drum, and the other things feel, softer, less energetic. So by compressing it, I get this sense of hearing them all more clearly, and I get a better sense in a way of the intensity of all the drums being hit, because they're on a much closer level relative to each other, and I'm not hearing it in little pieces dynamically. Okay, that's the best way I can describe it. Great, and then I can start mixing in some other stuff. I can do this with this. There's my snare. So I'm going to compress it while I'm listening to everything, so I can get a sense of how. So by compressing the snare has a really distinct resonance, right? I turned it very loose, right? I didn't muffle it much. That's what they like to do for some of these rock tracks. So you can hear it, bong, bong. So when I'm compressing it, right, without the compressor, I get a lot of stick, and the bang part is relatively low. When I compress it, right, I'm bringing the attack down, so I'm getting much more of the bong, the ring of the drum. That's the note that's playing. Feels a little bit longer, and effectively it is, just because we're hearing it better. We've brought the stick part of it down and can raise it up. So the softer part of the ring before was dying out to such a degree that we couldn't even hear it because it got buried under the other drums. Now, because we can bring the whole sound up higher with the makeup gain, we can hear the tail of the snare a little better. Okay, again, not this night and day difference. That's pretty aggressive, actually, that compressor. I might even ease up on it a little bit, but then again, for a rock track, it kind of works. Right? It sounds good. So that's the difference. Instead of the snare going boom, it's going boom. Right? It's like a quarter of a second longer on the ring, and that just gives it sort of more energy. Okay. All right. Mixing sounds together, so I have to make these adjustments relative to the other instruments. Okay?
And then the compression distance, like about -10 between highs and lows, it will be for all the drums or all instruments?
What is it? No, I mean, you can look at the meter for each instrument and get a clue from it. So if we look at this snare drum I'm playing right now, see it's -7, -27, it's almost 20 decibels.
We're gonna make it like closer to 10.
Thereabouts.
About.
So yeah, I mean, 10's a good range. 15's, you know, there's no hard fast rule. But 27 is definitely too much.
So like 10 is for all the drums or other instruments as well?
Well, no, 10 is sort of the range that we're trying to live in. So it's not for the drums or for this or that. 10 is sort of the window just in general. Okay? That's what I'm saying. Don't try to memorize a number. That's not going to work. You do it by ear. Okay? 10 is just the maximum. So if I say, okay, you know, I'm going to get what size pizza do you want? A large. And you have so much pizza. Okay?
Best
You don't want to
sound.
order 2 larges because you go, I'm never going to eat that. The other one's just going to go to waste.
It's like best sounding within this 10 range that we have.
10 or yeah, 10 is
So,
a pretty good window. That's why I demonstrated there. That's a good range for us to have our stuff living in. It doesn't have to be 10.
Because
What I'm
if it's
saying,
like
20 is too much.
well, 20 is too much. That's what I wanted.
Yes, that's 2 pizzas. We don't want 2 pizzas. We just want 1. So, all right. But I'm going to slowly just so we can hear the difference. Right, so we get the hit from the start, but when I compress it, we get a little more of the ring because we're effectively bringing the ring up. Right? So the snare sound feels a little longer. It kind of drags a little more. Instead of just bop, we get bam. It has a little tail on it. Right? That adds excitement to our drum sound. It's like we hear more snare, basically. We've got a pretty rockin' drum sound there. Let's finish it off. Let's just get these rooms going. Same thing, right? I can put these 2 rooms into our favorite thing in the whole world, right? Into a routing folder. Alright, we'll call this drum. Great. Stereo, beautiful. Alright, I don't know why we're not going to because I'm using HDMI. That's fine. Alright. And let's see, let's put these up to here. They're only about 12 decibels of difference, but nonetheless, I'll play it by itself so you can hear it. So those were the room mics, which were the Omni mics that were in front of the kit, right? They pick up a pretty cool sound. They pick up the whole drum set, basically. So what I want to do, again, to add a lot of energy, I really want to get that dynamic range, even though it's only 12 right now. For these room mics, I really want to get it super focused. So that it just has all that energy squeezed into a small space, right? Because we can hear how much energy. We're actually getting the best sense of how hard I was hitting the drums. I'm not the hardest hitter around, okay? But nonetheless, the room mics give us the best sense of that. The close mics don't at all, right? The close mics are like, right? And you're like, well, you could be the hardest hitter in town. You won't get that. But when you hear the room, and remember I was talking about that, why we use the room mics? Because our brain starts piecing the story together. It goes, whoa. That drum is reverberating like crazy in that room. That person's hitting those things, right? That's actually one of the gripes I have. I was listening to a Billy Cobham record this morning on my morning commute, and he's an amazing drummer. No doubt he hits hard because I've seen shows of him playing live. Right? He's kind of a fusion prog type of drummer, jazz guy too. But I mean, he was like a fusion rock drummer, But a lot of his records, they did them in these 70s kind of studios that just sound like a closet. There's like no reverb at all, right? And it's so tight, and it's kind of a shame because he's such an amazing drummer that it kind of swallows up the drum sound a little bit. You don't really get the sound. Whereas Phil Collins or something, right? All his drum tracks, he always probably, made a point of making sure he was recording a pretty good sounding room. And you hear those Phil Collins tones, everybody loves them. They sound huge just because of the room, right? And you actually get a sense because our brain says, whoa, right? If I go like this, I can tell I'm clapping soft, but if our brain hears all that reverb and goes, whoa, that other sound must be having a lot more amplitude because it's filling the room more, right? We talked about that when I was recording. That's the principal function of these mics in the first place, right? So if it's giving us that sense of energy, because it's getting the reverberation of the room, it's giving me the best sense of how hard the drummer's hitting. If I can get that dynamic range into a really focused window, it's going to be like having a magnifying glass on that energy, and it's going to allow us to give that to the listener in a very digestible way, where that listener is going to be like, whoa, I can hear that drum set slamming in a, in a nice little package there, okay? Very easy to listen to. So I'm going to go ahead and throw a compressor on here, and well, we can go pretty fast. Of course, I would normally want to compress this in the OS. That's the same thing, fast attack. We're probably going to relatively high ratio. There we go. Right? So that's super aggressive, right? But it sounds very explosive, right? So packing all that energy into a smaller window. So it's kind of like the effect of if I were to, if you were to take all the energy of like a light bulb, and dissipate it over a broad range, or focus it like a laser, right? You're going to get all that energy crammed into. It's like a sonic laser in a sense, right? We're cramming that energy into a small window, and that's going to allow us to have that kind of explosive sound for the drums. Now it's funny because we're hearing the speakers in this room, and it's the same room, so that's kind of weird. Okay, so as I'm playing this, we're hearing more room in addition to the room, and it's actually kind of canceling it out a little bit. But nonetheless, hopefully you're looking at this and going, well, gee willikers, you added all those drum tracks without even touching the master fader at all, and the limiter's not even working. We still haven't even hit 0, even though I started at just -10, right? So hopefully that's demonstrating to you how much dynamic control we have over this drum sound right now, okay? With all those drums, summing them together, by now we easily should be clicking, okay? But because they're all compressed into a smaller window, we can get them sounding loud, effectively, high energy, without even clicking the output bus, okay? Or not even hitting that limiter yet, right? Without doing that, there. We'll compress some more stuff, but I think drums are kind of one thing that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to, think about compressing, or even just to see them recorded or to work with them. So everyone will be able to get to work with it and apply the same things, okay, based on what I'm talking about for your homework, okay. But does anyone have any questions specifically related to these concepts so far? Not something that I haven't talked about yet? Yeah.
So I noticed you are putting the ratio at what? I couldn't really see it.
Okay, well in this case, for most of these drums I was going high, so I was going like around 10. That's what I would consider high. That's because I had to be aggressive on the drums because the attack is so vastly distant from the resonance of the drum. If the ratio is too low, I have to move the threshold lower and lower and lower to get the same amount of compression, which starts eventually compressing the resonance, which is no good. So I need to keep the threshold a little higher, but just be a little more aggressive on the ratio. And then from there, you can do it to taste. But yeah, if you're doing acoustic drums, a 3 ratio or something is never going to get you anywhere. You're going to end up just having a very difficult time. So I would say, if anything, you could err on the side of going higher than 10 or 12. You could probably go to 20 and still get very helpful, because that's what we're trying to do is keep the threshold high. Okay, so you could go even higher, but lower than 10, you're really going to start running into trouble with acoustic drums because that range is so huge.
So the dynamic range of it, whereas if it was an amplifier.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, we'll look at some other instruments as well. So yeah, we've only looked at the drums so far, and generally speaking, they've all had some pretty huge ranges. Okay. Anyone else have any other questions about these concepts?
So you said the ratio, you look at the peak compared to the average, or
Yeah, exactly.
and
Yeah, that's like a clue.
the higher that difference, the more ratio you apply to it, or?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, because otherwise we would have to move the threshold lower and lower to get the same amount of compression. Right. The ratio is a mathematical fraction. Okay. If I use a 3-to-1 ratio, it's going to reduce the sounds above the threshold to 1/3 of what they were before. Right, 3-to-1. If I do 10-to-1, they're going to reduce them to 1/10 of what they were before. Okay, that's simple.
Above threshold.
So, of course, above threshold. Oh, that's what the threshold is by definition. Yeah.
And we said this threshold, is there like a good understanding how to set that threshold?
I'm sorry.
Is there a good, how would I set this threshold? Like how would I make that
Well, the
decision?
way I did, you turn it down until it sounds good.
Mm.
Yeah, that's why I turned the screen off. Yeah, so you do it by ear, where you achieve the result that you desire, and then it's good to go. And then, of course, once we've compressed it, we want to use makeup gain to get our level back to where it was, which usually I get my stuff peaking around -10. Okay, so if I compress it and it goes down to peaking to -8 or to -13 or -14, I'm going to pump it up a little bit to get it back up to -10, so I have some latitude in my mix. Okay. As we know, I like my signals to be around -10. That gives me the perfect amount of headroom to actually do some mixing. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, Michael.
So if you're using like a virtual drum kit, would you try to emulate that large room sound by adding reverb to the room mic?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If the drum samples have a room mic, I would add reverb to the room mic, not necessarily to the individual hits, because that won't sound very realistic. So yeah, that's a good observation. If the room mic isn't present or something like that, the overheads maybe could work, but yeah, we want it to have a distant, whatever microphones have the most distant sound, we can embellish that with more reverb. I've done that before with pretty convincing results. In fact, I can even do that in here, like if I record a classical performance, I have these mics hanging here, and I'll record classical performances, and then if I want it to sound like it's in a little bit bigger hall than our hall here, I can put a little reverb on those, and it sounds very, very natural. You'd be none the wiser. You think I was in a bigger concert hall.
Those are microphones?
Yep, yeah, there's 3 microphones that I installed here. Well, here, I just did a recording today. I'll show you guys later. Remind me before class ends at like 8:15 or 8:20. I'll show you guys a recording I did today with Professor Simeonov.
Nice focus.
Any other questions about compressing the drums and why we made the decisions we made? We could start compressing some other stuff. Okay, fantastic. All right, well, let's continue our compression journey here. Let's move on to bass, right? Let's get this rhythm section dialed in. So I'm going to go compressor on the bass. Pro compressor. Great, easy peasy. So let's look at Let's get a clue. Once again, let's just get a clue from looking at the bass meter and what we've got there, without even listening to it necessarily. Right? We can see it's about -12 and -22, 23, so it's about 10. Okay. Now there was actually quite a bit of distortion on that bass. It was running through an amp. Okay, so even with that, we can still see that there's quite a bit of range there that we might want to get under control. Okay. Let's turn up so we can hear it, and let's balance it in our mix. through the amp and it had a little distortion on it and so forth, the attack is pretty strong on that bass, okay? So when I put that little bit of compression, hopefully you can hear it, it just gets a little bit fuller. The low end part of the bass comes up a little bit, okay? Again, we're not trying to do night and day things. Each of these steps is 1%, 1%, 1%. But after 30 different adjustments, right, we get a big change overall. Okay, but each of the changes is relatively small. All right, so let's just listen to that one more time. I'm just literally behind them, so I can't really hear everything, but I feel like I'm picking up on it, okay? But same idea, okay? And in fact, I should have probably had a faster track on it too. Alright, but basically, the bass sound is all living in a smaller window, okay? So the attacks are not significantly louder than the bass note. The two are in a much closer space. All right, and I'm just going to zip through the rest here, and then maybe we can talk about EQ. More focused in terms of the dynamic range. I want to look at what else I got. Oh, this guitar comes in over here, so I'm just going to skip that a little bit. Consistency when I turn it on, right? It's like it feels more, a little bit more present, and that's just because the different parts of the signal are being more focused. Okay. That I could use if I wanted to, so on and so forth. So I'm gonna skip over that. But so right now we basically have our mix like mostly started, okay? And getting those dynamics under control is going to now allow us to EQ, because we don't want to really EQ things before our compressors, because then the compressor is going to change the EQ. Okay? In other words, if I cut out a resonance out of something like I'm about to do on the kick drum before the compressor, and then compress the kick drum, that resonance is now going to be raised back up again, right? It's not really going to suit me very well. So I want to get my dynamics under control so that when I do apply my equalization, it's fixed. It's not going to be affected by the compressor, okay? It will if it's before the compressor. So I want to get my dynamic range under control and my levels roughly set like they are now, and now I can go in and start applying the equalizers as a means of basically primarily carving out things that each of those sounds doesn't need to make space for the different sounds relative to each other, okay? So like in this case, obviously, the kick drum, for example, is going to occupy, I think of every instrument as basically having like a high area and a low area, roughly. Okay, so the kick drum, for example, we could think of as having somewhere down really low, like in the sub bass area, okay, like 50 or something like that. And then a really bright part up in like the 5 or 6K, let's say, for the attack, okay? Maybe a little lower, but there's a huge space in the middle of the kick drum that we really don't need there. And that's because the guitar is going to live in that space. In other words, what's going to live between 400 and 2000, the electric guitar for sure. So I can remove those things out of the kick drum, right, to make more space in that frequency range for the guitar to live, and then they're not competing with each other, okay? Or the snare. The snare is going to live at around 200 on the bass, and maybe also pretty high up on the snares, right? Like maybe 6, 7, 8K for the brightest part of the snare, okay? And then I can think about, okay, cool. Well then, I'm not going to need 50 or 100 on the snare. I can filter that out, right? That's because the snare is not living on its own, right? The kick drum is probably bleeding into it, so I need to cut that out, basically. Okay. Yeah, Mike.
How do you determine which parts of an instrument you're carving out?
Well, so the way, I'll show you how you can kind of do some exercise, some listening exercises to figure it out. But yeah, it's something that comes with experience. But let's figure out, I'll show you sort of how I might go about trying to determine that and to learn by listening. So let's kick drum, right? Maybe I'll start by EQing and let's pull up this, of course I jumped to a part of the song where there's absolutely no kick drum. Okay, so let's pull up our EQ. And let's grab a parametric frequency here at start 200, right? And we can listen and just start making judgments. Like, does that sound like that's a good part of the instrument or not? That's something I would need, right? In this case, absolutely not. That sounds really bad, right? And then maybe I can sweep it around and just see what else, like, do I need that in the kick? Not really. So really, a lot of this stuff I don't really need in this drum, right? Now I go down
Here
here,
we go.
and now we're starting to get to territory where I feel like I do want that sound. Alright, like down here. Let's put this parametric, right? Let's make this more focused, right? Right, so we get down here, and I'm like, oh, I do want this in the kick drum, okay? I want this low bass note. Okay? And that's kind of like close to where the kick drum is tuned as well. Okay? Or on the top end, I could also discover relative to the attack or the transient, right, where that might be. That sounds good, yeah. Let's scan a little faster now, right? I can say, oh, the meter's right around here somewhere, right? I can hear it pretty clearly. That's kind of what I said earlier. I said about 6K. So I said about 50 and 6K. And that just holds true because most drummers are going to have a 22-inch kick or something like that, so it's not going to be too far off from there, right, in like 90% of cases. I'm talking about rock drums too in this case, right? But yeah, the kick drums are going to be mostly in the same size, so they're going to occupy space. But that's how you do it, by just playing around, by boosting some frequencies and seeing if you can hear, like, does that sound like something I need in this sound? Like, that doesn't sound like something I need in my kick drum, right? Sounds like a plastic box or something, or like a wood block or something, I don't know, right? That has some snap, right? I might be able to use that in my mix, right? Or this too, right? Those are the two parts of the kick that I do want. But now, I don't necessarily just jump and start boosting the frequencies that I desire. Instead, I'm going to think about cutting out the stuff that I don't need, since since I already know that that stuff's there, that's gonna be my first step, is like, okay, let me take out the stuff out of the kick drum that I know I'm not gonna need, and preserve the stuff that I do want. Okay, and in turn, these spaces are spaces where other things have to live. Like I said, I really want to EQ, right? And I can take out all that stuff in the middle that I don't need. And I have the low part still intact, and I have the high part still intact for the sound. And then I've actually lost a little bit of energy because, right, about 4 decibels of sound here have been reduced by cutting out these frequencies, right? Look how much like boxy, it sounds like a cardboard box, right? Now I'm getting the parts that I really just want, which are the bass note, which is the note the drum's actually tuned to, and then the attack of the beater. Right? Okay. So by reducing those bad sounds, it gives me a lot more latitude. I can crank that bass drum up, basically ad infinitum. I don't gotta speak Latin. Right. No, I can crank it up as much as I want because the bad stuff's not coming with it. It's just the good stuff. And that's what I mean by latitude, right? I want to have my instruments focused in such a way. First I have the dynamics focused, and then I have the frequencies with the parts that I don't need cut out, and then as I crank that bass drum up, I'm not going to hesitate to turn it up louder, because otherwise, without the EQ, I would have hesitation, because as I start turning up that kick drum, it'd be like, all this other crap come along with it. I may not be thinking that way, but that's just a feeling I'm going to get. I take all that out, I just have the snap and the bass drum and the low bass note. I can crank it up and the bad stuff's gone, it's not coming along for the ride, and it goes along. Before I had the kick drum right around here. Okay, now I can't hear too well.